A few of us from church were at the Grant County Fair a couple weeks ago, helping out with the Story Barn that our church was volunteering at to share the gospel with some of the kids coming to the Story Barn. And what we like to do was Shirley would sit down and talk to the kids, and then another person from church and I were standing talking to the parents. And so as the kids were over there in the corner, as I was talking to a couple of the parents, we heard a loud, "Jesus," from one of the kids. And then me and the parent kind of kept talking a little bit more, and then we hear another, "Jesus." And we're kind of chit-chatting some more, and we hear another loud, "Jesus," from the little girl that Shirley's talking to. And eventually the mom admits, "My 3-year-old and 4-year-old already know the right answer to every question is Jesus." And kids usually learn that if they've been in church or talking to Shirley, sharing the gospel there. They learn that the right answer to most questions is Jesus. And while we say the right answer to questions is Jesus, what would be the right response to Jesus if he showed up and was in front of us? And to take that a step further, not only what would be the right response, but how would other people respond when they see us respond to Jesus, if they see us responding to Jesus? And if we take that one step further, would we truly understand what our response was if Jesus showed up? If he showed up and we responded to him, years later as we look back on that, would we know that we responded the right way? Or would we have understood what we were doing in that moment? In our passage today, as we continue to move through the Gospel of John, we see responses of people to Jesus. And we see those responses, some of them as a model for us to follow, and others are cautions for us to avoid. And as we've been going through the Gospel of John, we spent 2 weeks in chapter 11, where we saw Lazarus raised from the dead, Jesus' 7th and final miracle recorded in the book. And then we saw those various ways that people either accepted Jesus or rejected Jesus based on that miracle. And starting in chapter 12, we begin to see a transition. Chapters 1 through 11 covered the first 3 years of Jesus' life, but chapters 12 through 21 are going to cover about a week of his life. The timing slows down drastically, and John starts to record lots more details about this last week of Jesus' life. And it not just slows down in the timing, the focus also shifts from Jesus' public ministry to everybody in John chapter 1 through 11 to his private ministry in chapters 12 to 21. So in our passage today, we're going to look at the different responses people have to Jesus. We see preparation from a woman first. We see persecution from a group of religious leaders. And then we see praise from several groups of everyday common people. And we see that preparation of Jesus by Mary in the first 8 verses. It says, "Jesus, therefore, 6 days before the Passover, came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. And so they made him a supper there. And Martha was serving. But Lazarus was the one of those reclining at the table with him. Mary then took a pound of very costly perfume of pure nard, and anointed the feet of Jesus, and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples who was intending to betray him, said, 'Why was this perfume not sold for 3,000 denarii and given to poor people?' Now he said this not because he was concerned about the poor, but because he was a thief. And as he had the money box, he used to pilfer what was put into it. Therefore Jesus said, 'Let her alone, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For you always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me.'" So the text tells us this is 6 days before the Passover. So it's probably Saturday, as we understand the days of the week, at least from our point of view as Protestant Christians. It's probably Saturday. And they're in Bethany. Now, we learned last week that in Jerusalem, Jesus had his picture posted at the post office as that most wanted person that the religious leaders all wanted to get. But in Bethany, Jesus is treated like a king and offered a dinner. He's welcomed and accepted. And the text says that they made him a supper there. These people have organized a dinner for him. Now, some people would say this same dinner is the same one that's described in other Gospels that was held at Simon the leper's home, which means if they're having dinner at a leper's home, Jesus has already healed the leper. He wouldn't have dinner at a leper's home. So Jesus has healed a leper. He has raised Lazarus from the dead, but the supper isn't prepared for the two guys that were healed. It's prepared in worship for Jesus there. And the focus here is on the woman, Mary, and her reverence for Jesus. We see a pound of perfume that she gives to Jesus. 12 ounces was a Roman pound of costly perfume of pure nard, and anointed the feet of Jesus, and she wiped his feet with her hair. Mary is figuratively putting flowers on Jesus' casket before he's even dead. Because in ancient times, they didn't have a way to embalm a body. They didn't have freezers where they could preserve a body. So what they would do when someone died is they would rinse the body and clean it, and then they would cover it in perfume and oil to preserve it and keep it from smelling until they could bury it. And what Mary is doing here is she's preparing Jesus' body with this perfume before he has even been killed. So we see this perfume that she gives, but we also see her position as a slave at his feet. Being at someone's feet and cleaning someone's feet was the job of a slave, not of a friend, which Mary was. To touch someone's feet was degrading in their culture. Mary's got no dignity now, and she takes her position as a slave at Jesus' feet. And while she gives that pound of perfume, she takes her position at his feet. The place begins to fill up with the fragrance of the perfume. John was probably there and could smell it. If you ever walked through the perfume section, maybe of Macy's, you can understand how perfume can kind of just fill up a place. And sometimes it even sticks to you as you go other places and people come close to you and can smell it. But we're reminded here that through Mary's actions, one commentator says, a loving heart judges no offering too precious for Christ. Publicly, we've seen how the chief priest, Caiaphas, the Sanhedrin, and others are preparing to kill Jesus publicly, but privately, Mary is here preparing Jesus for his death. What she really is doing is worship. She's worshiping Jesus. And our word for worship comes from the Old Testament and New Testament, which means to bow down or to prostrate yourself before God. In the Old English, it came from the word worthship, meaning what you worshipped was worthy of worship. And in the New Testament, it's described as something we do together corporately as a congregation, or we can worship individually. To worship means we give reverence offered to a divine being. It's extravagant respect or admiration for or devotion to an object of esteem. Charles Swindoll talks about worship here of Mary. He says, worship should be an outpouring of complete devotion, holding back nothing, expressed by a sincere heart, which is what we see Mary doing here to Jesus. But Mary was misunderstood and criticized. As soon as that perfume reaches Judas's nose, he speaks up and criticizes her. He references how this was 300 denarii, which was about a year's wages for a day laborer or someone that worked in agriculture. And Judas speaks up in jealousy, not because he thinks that money should have been used for good, but because he now sees that could have been money I could have taken for myself if it was given to me, to us. And Mary, as we look at Mary here, it's a reminder for us that our actions of worship sometimes are criticized by others inside the church. Sometimes that criticism that we have as Christians comes from outside the church, and we can usually accept that, and that's a little easier to handle. When people we are talking to and they say, why do you go to church on a Sunday? You should sleep in. If they don't go to church, it's a little easier to understand. Why would you work all day and then go to a Bible study after work? They don't understand. Those type of criticisms we can accept for people that are outside of the church. It's a little easier for us to shake those off. But the criticism that's hard is when people inside the church criticize what we do. Just as Judas is part of the 12, sometimes people that are part of our churches might criticize what we do. And sadly, that's often criticism that's given to people in the church that want to do outreach or maybe change the way things are done in a church to reach new people. Those usually are the folks that are criticized in churches. I have a friend in Nebraska that I talk to regularly, and we're reading a book called The Autopsy of a Deceased Church. On the cover, it's got a big old scalpel on the cover. It's kind of an interesting book cover. And in that book, this author had talked to 14 different churches that all got small and died. And he did interviews with the former members of those churches to try to figure out what was it that caused those churches to die. And one of the significant things was that there were people in the churches that noticed things were changing and maybe wanted to make subtle changes in the church. But those people were often criticized and put down and ignored. And as a result, those people left the church to find another place to worship. And that was one of the reasons that the church died. And those are the people sometimes that experience that criticism and go find another church. And that story of Mary is just one of those good, righteous acts of worship aren't always accepted by everyone in the church. But that criticism doesn't just come from inside the church. We see in the next 3 verses that criticism of our worship sometimes comes from people outside of the church. Starting in verse 9. The large crowd of the Jews that learned that Jesus was there, and they came not for Jesus' sake only, but that they might also see Lazarus, whom he raised from the dead. But the chief priests planned to put Lazarus to death also, because on account of him, many of the Jews were going away and were believing in Jesus. Now, this large crowd of Jews, these are people that have come to investigate in Bethany, which was about 2 miles away from Jerusalem. They've come to investigate this miracle of Lazarus. Word has been spreading that Jesus raised this guy from the dead, and they come there to investigate and see what happens. But this causes problems for those chief priests in verse 10. And as we remember, these chief priests, they were in charge of kind of keeping religious order. They were in charge of making sure that people followed the rules so that the Jews could follow their religion. God had given the Jews a law back in Deuteronomy and said, if you follow this law, I will protect you and you'll be independent. If you disobey this law, I'm going to let other nations come and conquer you. He says that in Deuteronomy 28 and 32. But as we know, Judah failed that law. They started to be disobedient, so God sent Isaiah, Jeremiah, Obadiah, Joel, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, all prophets to warn Judah that if you don't follow God's law, I'm going to let other nations come and conquer you. And that happened in 605 BC, 597 BC, and 586 BC, when King Nebuchadnezzar comes to Judah and Jerusalem and levels their city and their temple. But God gives them hope. During those 70 years of exile, they've lost their temple, they've lost their country, they've lost all their sovereignty. God gives them hope and says, if you start to follow me again, I'll keep those promises to you. I'll send that Messiah to you just like I always promised. And that's where we find these chief priests and leaders. They're now under the control of Rome, and they're forced with that difficult position where they have to try to follow the law, but they also have to not make the Romans mad at them. Because if the Romans get upset at them, they'll take away their freedom to still practice and follow the law. In chapter 11, verse 48, we saw that fear where they said, the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. It was a real fear, not of just the religious leaders losing their temple or their control, but if Jesus causes too many issues, they're going to lose their ability to even worship at the temple they have. And that's what they're forced to deal with. And because of that, they start to persecute Jesus and anyone associated with him. And that's where we see Lazarus. He's kind of caught in the middle. He's innocent. He literally is just laying there in verses 9, 10, and 11. But the text tells us the chief priests are trying to kill not just Jesus, but Lazarus also. It kind of reminds us of chapter 9 in John where Jesus had healed that blind man, and the Pharisees and the leaders want to know, who is this guy that healed you? And the blind man always says, I don't know. I used to be blind. Now I see. I don't know what else to tell you. But as a result, the chief priests and scribes, they kick the man out of the temple, and his family, they kick him out of the temple. Lazarus' allegiance to Jesus, just being with Jesus, having a meal, brings persecution to Lazarus. Because of Lazarus' relationship with Jesus, he's now being persecuted, and they want to kill him too. Which kind of makes you laugh a little bit, because Jesus already brought him back from the dead, and their solution is to kill Lazarus again. Okay, if that's your plan, interesting, but that was their plan. And as we read about them wanting to kill Lazarus, it reminds us our acts of worship sometimes causes others to persecute us. Our acts of worship sometimes causes others to persecute us. I've heard stories of college professors maybe that teach biology or physics at a university, and they become Christians, and all of a sudden they're ostracized by their colleagues they work with, the communities that they're part of in academia. All of a sudden their papers they try to get published in journals are rejected, things like that. Sometimes our worship of God causes persecution. We've all heard of stories of people in other countries that are persecuted simply because they open a Bible and read it in public, or because they have a few friends or family members over for a Bible study. They're persecuted and put in prison. Often in our worship service, I'll say we're fortunate to live in a country where we can worship God or sing to Him. And I hope that doesn't sound kind of cliche or trite, but it is a privilege we have living in America where we have that freedom. But what can we do about this when our worship of God causes others to persecute us? Well, one, we need to be ready for it and to expect it. We shouldn't be surprised if our faith brings persecution or problems to us. I referenced how our church went with Child Evangelism Fellowship to the fair and got to share the gospel there. That's a great privilege we have. We might not always have that privilege. There might be a day where they say, we're not going to let you do that. We need to be ready for those things to happen. Last year, an attorney contacted our church saying, I heard that you had submitted some flyers to a school district and they didn't, distribute your flyers. I want to know more about that because there's some other Christian groups that didn't have their flyers distributed either. I said, well, it doesn't surprise me that they didn't have their flyers distributed for their Good News Club. Christians, we're no longer the majority in our culture. We're the minority, even here on this side of the state. So we need to be ready for that persecution, but we also need to fight for the equality that non-Christians and atheists and agnostics all want for everyone, but sometimes try to deny people with Christian beliefs. Just this year, we heard about that football coach for a high school that would pray after the football games. and he eventually lost his job, and he took the schools to court, and he eventually won. Because in his opinion, I'm just expressing my personal faith and belief. And shouldn't I have that right within a public school to express my personal belief? Or if you're familiar with the God's Not Dead movies that have come out in the last decade, those stemmed from groups of college students and college clubs that were denied the same rights as sororities and fraternities on college campuses to organize themselves or to use public spaces, right? That's what those movies came from. Those Christian groups that just wanted the same rights as everybody else. But in John's narrative here, he shifts from this quiet dinner party with Mary and Lazarus and Martha and Bethany, and he shifts to a public parade in Jerusalem that you're probably very familiar with. In chapter 12, verse 12, it says, on the next day, so that's probably Sunday, on the next day, the large crowd who had came to the feast, when they heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem, took the branches of palm trees and went out to meet him and began to shout, Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, even the King of Israel. Jesus, finding a young donkey, sat on it, as it is written, Fear not, daughter of Zion. Behold, your king is coming, seated on a donkey's colt. These things his disciples did not understand at first. But when Jesus was glorified, then they remembered that these things were written of him, and that they had done these things to him. So the people who were with him, when he was called Lazarus out of the tomb and raised him from the dead, continued to testify about him. For this reason also the people went and met him, because they heard that he had performed this sign. So the Pharisees said to one another, You see that we're not doing any good. The world has gone after him. So it's that next day, it's probably Sunday, which we often call as Palm Sunday. And there are three different groups you might have noticed as we've read through this passage. There's that group in Bethany that was out with Jesus and met him there. They heard about that miracle of Lazarus, and they've gone out to Bethany to meet Jesus. That's the first group. Then there's this group from Jerusalem. They hear Jesus is coming to Jerusalem, and they go out to meet him. So there's a group following Jesus from behind. There's a group approaching him from in front. But there's also a third group that were with Mary when Lazarus was raised from the dead. And these three groups, along with maybe the disciples, we'll add a fourth group, are there with Jesus. And they erupt in praise. We see their actions when it says they took palm branches from the palm trees and went out to meet them. Now, palm trees were a symbol of prosperity because they were green, always green, but they're also a symbol of victory throughout the Bible. And that's what these people are declaring, that Jesus is their king, their Messiah, and he's going to bring them victory when they lay down those palm branches. That's their actions. But then we see their announcement. They shout, Hosanna, which is a transliteration of the Hebrew word meaning, please save, or save us now. We're tired of being under the Romans. We are ready for you to save us and restore us back to the kingdom that we once had. But notice the animal Jesus came on doesn't quite match that action or that announcement, at least in how they were thinking. In the ancient Near East, if a king came to a city in peace, he would ride a donkey. If he came on a horse, it meant he was coming in war to fight. And that's what Jesus does here. He's not just riding a donkey, he's riding a young donkey to further emphasize he's coming in peace. St. Augustine, who I told this story when we were going through Galatians, his amazing conversion story, says, Christ's kingship over Israel was not for the purpose of exacting tribute or putting swords into soldiers' hands, but subduing his enemies, of subduing his enemies by open warfare. But he was king of Israel and exercising kingly authority over their inward natures. in consulting for their eternal interests, in bringing into his heavenly kingdom those whose faith and hope and love were centered in himself. Accordingly, for the Son of God, the Father's equal, the Word by whom all things were made, in his good pleasure to be King of Israel, was an act of condensation and not of promotion, a token of compassion and not any increase in power. For he who was called on earth the King of Jews is in heaven the Lord of angels. Jesus came in peace. He didn't ride a wheeled vehicle as some of the kings often did. He didn't take a war horse or a sword or wear a crown or hold his trophies. He rode a young donkey to fulfill that prophecy of Zechariah 9:9, to show that he came in peace. And at the end of verse 14, we see the reaction. It says, as it is written. See, the ball is now in the court of the observers, the commoners and the religious leaders. Jesus has fulfilled the Old Testament prophecies. Now it's the people watching this that are expected to respond. Those religious leaders had to decide, what are we going to do about this? Probably fearful again that there was going to be an uprising. And even the disciples saw it happen but didn't seem to understand what was going on. In verse 16, John gives his commentary. He often slides in there. The disciples and those close to Jesus did not understand what was happening. They lacked the perspective of the cross and the resurrection, and they didn't see what was happening then. It says they did not understand at first, but it was not until, in verse 16, Jesus was glorified, they remembered. When it says Jesus is glorified, it refers to Jesus' death, burial, resurrection, and his ascension. It wasn't until after those events they were able to see, I understand. Picturing this through the disciples' minds, it reminds us our acts of worship sometimes are not understood by us or ourselves until later on, as we've been walking with Christ for a while. One of our friends in California was a guy named Kerry Elbisi that worked for a couple decades as a cop, as a police officer. And his wife, him and his wife came over for dinner once, and I asked Kerry, how did you end up attending our church, or what's your story? And he told me his conversion story about how his wife was deathly ill in the hospital. And Kerry said, God, I've always believed in you. I've never been to church. I've never read a Bible. But if you will heal my wife, I will serve you and commit to do whatever you want of me, he said. And God healed his wife. And a little while later, Kerry gets a phone call from his good friend Steve. And Steve said, I'm going to start this group called Celebrate Recovery at our church, where we're going to gather 50 or 60 people each Wednesday night. And it's people that are struggling with addictions of alcohol and drugs. And we're going to do ministry to people that have been addicted to drugs and alcohol. And he said, Kerry, I'm scared to talk in front of people, but I know you are really good with a microphone. So Kerry, would you be the MC every Wednesday for my Celebrate Recovery group? To which Kerry said, that's great. Sure, I'll help you, Steve. I told God I'd do whatever he wanted me to do. So Kerry gets up there with a microphone and realizes out of the 60 people in this room, he has arrested about 15 of them. 10 of them more than once. But he realized, I told God I would do whatever he wanted me to do. My worship of God will be whatever it takes because he healed my wife. Sometimes we don't understand that worship in the moment. And even as we follow Christ, sometimes we say, I'm going to place my faith in you, God, for salvation. But then 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years later, he starts to show us, and the Holy Spirit starts to show us some of our weaknesses and our struggles and the way we need to grow. He might reveal to us some of the things we watch maybe are not God-honoring, like R-rated movies or things like that. Maybe how we use our money doesn't honor God the way it should, where we spend every single penny we get as fast as we could. Maybe how we talk with our foul language or our gossip doesn't honor God. Or maybe how we spend our time doesn't honor him either. We place our faith in Jesus at one time and we say, God, I'll worship you. But sometimes 5 or 10 or 25 years later, he's still showing us how that worship looks different. So as we wrap up our time together, we've seen in this passage the appropriate responses to Jesus and how those responses are a response of worship. And we worship Jesus because he's the Son of God. He's God in the flesh, fully God, fully man. And that worship leads to actions of service that sometimes get criticized by people inside the church. Sometimes our association with Jesus and just being with him and following him brings us persecution and criticism from people outside the church. And it shouldn't surprise us that sometimes our worship over time doesn't make sense to us in the moment, but over time we start to learn and grow and change in what that worship looks like. Let's pray. God, thank you for your word, which reminds us that it's our faith in you that leads to salvation